Beatlemania swept the planet like wildfire. In just a few years, 4 unknown amateur musicians from provincial Liverpool turned into superstars. The charts were dominated entirely by Beatles songs. The band had to escape from crowds of frantic fans. People spent their last money on records, begging their parents for cash by any means. At Beatles concerts, girls fainted, and guys all got the Beatles haircut. When John Lennon said in a 1966 interview that the Beatles are more popular than Jesus, he had every reason to think so. A meteoric rise that was bound to raise questions and spark a few curious conspiracy theories. Is it true that Beatles records contain hidden satanic messages? Did Paul McCartney really die and get replaced by a lookalike with help from MI6 agents? Was the British royal family behind the Beatles' rise and the sexual revolution? What do escorts and a Soviet naval attaché have to do with it? And most importantly, was the Beatles' music actually written by a secret military institute developing methods of mass mind control? These are all real theories that were once fairly popular. The Beatles and the myths surrounding them are the alpha and omega of music-related conspiracy theories. Let's try to unpack some of it. Lennon had to publicly apologize at a special press conference for his comment about Jesus, but it didn't help. Conservative America wasn't having it, and in some states, mass public burnings of Beatles records began. The US was going through a rough time with the so-called British invasion. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Animals, and dozens of other British bands suddenly became insanely popular and trendy. From the point of view of conservative American parents, the teens who listened to them started acting strange. They stopped obeying their elders, skipped church, and danced like they were possessed. Conservatives figured there had to be some kind of satanic influence at play, probably through the musicians themselves. It was believed that the records contained secret messages recorded backwards. The funny thing is, sometimes they actually did. It was already a fairly well-known trick by then called backmasking. You can record speech onto a vinyl record or magnetic tape in reverse. The result sounds like gibberish, but if someone figures out how to play it backwards, they'll hear a coherent message. Back in 1913, the famous British occultist Aleister Crowley actually recommended listening to records in reverse as part of magical practice. Musicians, being more down to earth, used backmasking to leave messages for fans or to get around censorship. The Beatles turned it into an artistic device. For example, in the song Rain. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, panic over hidden messages kept growing. It eventually reached the Arkansas state government. A law almost passed that would have required record labels to slap warnings on albums saying things like, "may contain hidden prayers to Satan." By that time, the main suspects were bands like Pink Floyd, and senators had to listen to Stairway to Heaven in reverse. It sounded so terrifying that the bill passed unanimously. Unfortunately for its supporters, it was vetoed by then-Governor Bill Clinton. Backmasking is also at the heart of the second major Beatles-related conspiracy theory, the death of Paul McCartney. We may think Paul is still alive and was even knighted, but according to supporters of this theory, he actually died in a car crash back in 1966 and was replaced by a double. Allegedly, he got into a fight with the other Beatles during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's, stormed off in a rage, ran a red light, and was decapitated in the crash. The rumors spread like wildfire, especially since McCartney had started appearing in public less often. By 1969, the Beatles' press office was flooded with inquiries from concerned fans and journalists. Sometimes people even called live from radio shows. Evidence? Supposedly there was plenty of it. For example, if you play the track Revolution 9 backwards, you can hear Lennon say, "Turn me on, dead man." If you do the same with I'm So Tired, it sounds like, "Paul is dead, man, miss him, miss him." And at the end of Strawberry Fields, Lennon supposedly says, "I buried Paul." People claimed the band was hiding what had happened, but leaving clues. For instance, if you really try, the Sgt. Pepper's album cover can be seen as depicting a funeral and a coffin, and on the back cover, Paul is the only one with his back to the viewer. On the cover of Abbey Road, McCartney is barefoot while the other 3 Beatles are wearing shoes. In the background, there's a Volkswagen Beetle with the license plate 28F, Paul's age if he had lived. On an alternate cover for the Yesterday and Today compilation, McCartney is sitting inside a trunk, another supposed coffin reference, and so on. What's more, Beatles producer George Martin actually mentioned the use of lookalikes in his memoir. They were sometimes hired to distract fans and help the band leave concerts unnoticed. The dead Beatle rumor got so big that Life magazine eventually had to run a cover story titled "Paul McCartney is Still With Us." It didn't help. They even named the supposed double, someone allegedly prepared by MI6. So what does the famous British intelligence agency have to do with any of this? Well, according to another conspiracy theory, quite a lot. It claims that the Beatles weren't just a band, but a national project promoted with support from the British royal family. Back in early 1963, the Beatles were just one of many Liverpool bands busy touring around the English provinces, and they were opening for Roy Orbison. Sure, some of their singles were doing reasonably well in the charts, but overall they didn't stand out much. Plenty of bands were playing similar music, but by October 1963, the Beatles appeared on the country's most prestigious music TV show and were greeted at the set by a mysterious crowd of fans no one had expected. The next day, newspapers ran headlines about Beatlemania. A month later, the Beatles played their second major concert, this time in front of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. The royals posed for photos with the band and even praised them to the press. After that, the Beatles landed on the front pages of every major paper, and not long after, all four members were awarded the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. What other little-known band had ever been promoted this fast and at such a high level? At first, the Beatles' future producer George Martin didn't want to sign them at all. He absolutely hated their demo, but as the story goes, someone from the top of the EMI Music Corporation called him and strongly urged him to take the band. Martin, a former military man who'd served as a lieutenant in naval aviation during World War II, wasn't in the habit of questioning orders from above. If it had to be done, it had to be done. And the person who brought him the demo, the Beatles' first manager Brian Epstein, died under strange circumstances in 1967, suicide at the very peak of his fame and financial success. So why would the British government need the Beatles? Well, for example, to distract the public from a major political scandal, the so-called Profumo affair. It turned out that half the conservative establishment was seeing the same osteopath. In reality, the osteopath turned out to be a pimp who hosted orgy parties and supplied high-profile clients with prostitutes. One of those clients was Secretary of State for War John Profumo, and that might have been manageable if not for the fact that the same woman was also sleeping with Soviet naval attaché Yevgeny Ivanov, a KGB officer. And not just sleeping with him, he was using her to gather intelligence. The scandal exploded. The conservative government, which had been in power for 12 years, started to unravel. Even Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, a political giant, was forced to resign. This all happened in 1963, but the press gave it surprisingly little coverage. Journalists were focused almost entirely on the Beatles and Beatlemania. Still, it's hard to believe that even a scandal that big would be enough to justify the rise of something like the Beatles. After all, they reshaped youth culture across the globe. From 1963 on, their popularity only grew, leading to the famous British invasion. Before the Beatles, England was seen as dull and gray, a country stuck in post-war poverty, decline, and the collapse of its empire. It was the Beatles who restored Britain's cultural dominance. And that brings us to the biggest and most far-reaching conspiracy theory about the Beatles. According to its supporters, the Beatles were backed by an entire team of specialists, composers, musicians, producers, and above all, psychologists. The so-called Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was founded back in the 1920s and originally focused on psychiatric issues faced by World War I veterans. Things like shell shock and PTSD. The Tavistock Clinic was founded by true luminaries. One of them, for example, was friends with Carl Jung. During World War II, the institute developed testing and selection methods for military officers. And after the war, it received funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and began advising private clients on matters of public opinion. That's the official story. According to the conspiracy version, though, the Institute was manipulating mass consciousness all along, using culture and media as tools. They assembled the top experts in mass psychology, and eventually came up with the idea of the British invasion, rock music, and youth culture as a whole. What makes this even funnier is that Beatles songs are sometimes attributed to Theodor Adorno, the philosopher and music theorist. Adorno is usually associated with the so-called Frankfurt School, a group of New Left intellectuals surrounded by all kinds of myths, who, after the failure of the World Revolution, supposedly decided to promote Marxism not through politics, but through culture. Adorno often criticized pop music as a mind-numbing, formulaic product. The theory suggests apparently that he applied everything he despised when creating the Beatles. His colleagues were allegedly responsible for everything else, from handling the press to arranging buses full of screaming girls. In this version of events, concerned American parents were actually right. Rock music really was a way to spark a youth rebellion. Only the culprits weren't Satanists with hidden messages, but a secret British research institute working to destabilize American society for its own dark purposes, and notably doing it quite successfully. Additionally, the US before the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s and the US after really are two completely different countries. By the way, the Beatles did quite a bit to promote psychedelics and soft drugs. That said, there's no real evidence of any schemes by the Tavistock Institute, just some very far-fetched coincidences. For example, people point out that the Beatles broke up just a year after Theodor Adorno died. Is there even a grain of truth to all this? Well, you could take a look at some of the Beatles' contemporaries. For instance, it wasn't exactly a secret that the Rolling Stones were designed to be a more rebellious alternative to the Beatles. And there's an even clearer example. In the second half of the 1960s, a band called the Monkees was topping the charts. Some might know them for the song I'm a Believer.
I saw her face, now I'm a believer.
Just like with Beatlemania, people talked about Monkey Mania, but the Monkees didn't write or perform their own music. They were a fictional band from a TV show. Studio musicians played and sang on the records, and the concerts were lip-synced. None of that stopped them from selling millions of records. Because to generate hype or manipulate public opinion, you don't actually need a conspiracy. A skilled producer can pull it off just fine, without Satan and without a secret research institute. Love you guys, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and comment your favorite band.